The emperor commissioned German officers to create a modern army and Englishmen to build a modern fleet. He sent Japanese to Europe to study Western medicine and to find out about all the other branches of Western knowledge which had made Europe so powerful. Following the example of the Germans, he established compulsory education so that his people would be trained to fight. The Europeans were delighted. What sensible little people that Japanese had turned out to be, opening up their country in this way. They made haste to sell them everything they wanted and show them everything they asked to see. Within a few decades, the Japanese had learned all that Europe could teach them about machines for war and for peace. And once they had done so, they complimented the Europeans politely as they once more stood at their gates. Now we know what you know. Now our steamships will go out in search of trade and conquest, and our cannons will fire on peaceful cities if anyone in them dares harm a Japanese citizen. The Europeans couldn't get over it, nor have they, even today. For the Japanese turned out to be the best students in all the history of the world. While Japan was beginning to liberate itself, very important things were also happening across the seas in America. As remember, the English trading post, which had grown into coastal cities on America's eastern seaboard, had declared their independence from England in 1776 in order to found a confederation of free states. British and Spanish settlers had meanwhile pressed on towards the west, fighting Indian tribes as they went. You must have read books about cowboys and Indians, so you will know what it was like. How farmers built log cabins and cleared the dense forest and how they fought. How cowboys looked after enormous herds of cattle and how the Wild West was settled by adventurers and gold diggers. New states sprang up everywhere on land taken from the tribes, although, as you can imagine, not much of that land had been cultivated. But the states were all very different from each other. Those in southern tropical regions lived off great plantations where cotton or sugar cane was cultivated on a gigantic scale. The settlers owned vast tracts of land, and the work was done by Negro slaves bought in Africa. They were very badly treated. Further north, it was different. It is less hot, and the climate is more like our own. So there you found um, farms and towns, not unlike those the British emigrants had left behind them, only on a much larger scale. They didn't need slaves because it was easier and cheaper to do the work themselves. And so the townsfolk of the northern states, who were mostly pious Christians, thought it shameful that the Confederation, founded in accordance with the principles of human rights, should keep slaves as people had in pagan antiquity. The southern states explained that they needed Negro slaves because without them they would be ruined. No white man, they said, could endure working in such heat, and in any case, Negroes weren't born to be free, and so on and so forth. In 1820, a compromise was reached. The states which lay to the south of an agreed line would keep slaves, those to the north would not. In the long run, however, the shame of an economy based on slave labor was intolerable, and yet it seemed that little could be done. The southern states, with their huge plantations, were far stronger and richer than the northern farmlands, and were determined not to give in any cost. But they met their match in President Abraham Lincoln. He was a man with no ordinary destiny. He grew up as a simple farm boy in the backwoods, fought in 1832 in a war against an Indian chief called Black Hawk, and became the postmaster of a small town. There, in his spare time, he studied law before becoming a lawyer and a member of parliament. As such, he fought against slavery and made himself thoroughly hated by the plantation owners of the southern states. Despite this, he was elected president in 1861. The southern states immediately declared themselves independent of the United States and founded their own confederation of slave states. 75,000 volunteers made themselves available to Lincoln straight away. Despite this, The outlook was very bad for the Northerners. Britain, which had abolished and condemned slave labor in its own colonies for several decades, was nevertheless hurting the slave states. There was a frightful and bloody civil war, yet in the end, the Northerners' bravery and tenacity prevailed, and in 1865, Lincoln was able to enter the capital of the Southern states to the cheers of liberated slaves. 11 days later, while at the theater, he was murdered by a Southerner, but his work was done. The reunited free United States of America soon became the richest and most powerful country in the world, and it even seems to manage without slaves. Two new states in Europe. I have known many people who were children at a time before either Germany or Italy existed. It seems incredible, doesn't it, that these great and powerful nations, which play such an important role, aren't old at all. After the revolutions of 1848, when new railway lines were being built all over Europe and telegraph cables were being laid, when the towns, which had turned into factory towns, were expanding and many peasants were being drawn into them, and when man had taken to wearing top hats and funny pince nez spectacles with dangling black cords, the Europe we know was still no more than a patchwork of tiny duchies, kingdoms, principalities, and republics linked to one another by complicated ties of allegi- uh, allegiance or enmity. In this Europe, if we ignore Britain, which was at this time more concerned with its colonies in America, India, and Australia than with the neighboring continent, there were three important powers. In the center of Europe stood the Empire of Austria. There, the Emperor Franz Joseph had been ruling from the imperial palace of Vienna since 1848. I saw him once myself when I was a little boy. He was by then an old man and was crossing the park at the palace of Schönbrunn. I also have a very clear memory of his state funeral. He really was what an emperor was meant to be. He ruled over all sorts of different peoples and countries. He was emperor of Austria, but he was also king of Hungary and count elevated to the rank of prince of the Tyrol, and had lots of other ancient titles, such as kings of Jerusalem and protector of the sacred tomb, a title that went back to the Crusades. Many provinces of Italy came under his authority, while others were ruled by members of his family. Then there were the Croats, the Serbs and Czechs, the Slovenes, the Slovaks, the Poles, and innumerable other peoples. For this reason, the words on old Austrian banknotes, for example, 10 crowns, also appear in all these other languages. The Emperor of Austria even had some power, at least in name, in the German principalities. But the situation there was rather complicated. When Napoleon shattered the last remnants of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation in 1806, the German Empire had ceased to exist. The many German-speaking lands, which included Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, Hanover, Frankfurt, Brunswick, and so on and so forth, then formed an association known as the German Confederation, to which Austria also belonged. All in all, it was a remarkably confusing picture, this German Confederation. Each speck of land had its own prince, its own money, its own stamps, and its own official uniform. It was bad enough when it took several days to get from Berlin to Munich by mail coach. But now that the same journey took less than a day by train, it had become almost unendurable. The patchwork presented by the lands of Germany, Austria, and Italy was quite unlike anything around them on the map. To the west was France. Shortly after the revolution of 1848, it had once again become an empire. One of Napoleon's descendants had been able to reawaken memories of the glory of the past, and although far from great himself, he was first elected president of the republic and soon afterwards emperor of the France under the name of Napoleon III. Despite all its wars and revolutions, France was now an exceptionally rich and powerful country with great industrial cities. To the east was Russia. The Tsar was not loved in that mighty land. You must bear in mind that by this time many Russians had studied at universities in France and Germany, and their outlook was quite modern and up to date. But the Russian Empire and its officials were still living in the Middle Ages. Just think, it was only in 1861 the serfdom was formally abolished, and then for the first time 23 million Russian peasants were promised an existence worthy of human dignity. Making promises is one thing, but keeping them is another. In Russia, generally speaking, government was by the lash, or the knout, as it was called. The penalty for speaking freely, for expressing even the mildest opinion, was exile to Siberia at the very least. Consequently, students and members of the middle classes who had received a modern education detested the Tsar so much that he lived in constant fear of assassination. This was in fact the fate of most Tsars, however hard they tried to guard against it. Beside the immensity of Russia and the battle-hardened might of France, it seemed impossible for any other country to make itself heard in Europe. With the loss of its Latin American colonies, beginning in 1810, Spain had become weak and powerless. Turkey, no longer in control of its European possessions, was now referred to in the newspapers as the sick man of Europe. As various Christian subject peoples had been fighting for their liberty with the enthusiastic support of the rest of Europe. The Greeks were first, followed by the Bulgarians, the Romanians, and the Albanians, while Russia, France, and Austria fought over the rest of Turkey's European possessions and Constantinople. It was just as well for Turkey, for none of those three countries was willing to surrender such a rich prize to any of the others. So Constantinople stayed Turkish. Meanwhile, France and Austria were still fighting over the Italian dominions as they had been for hundreds of years. But times had changed. Italians had also been brought closer to one another by their railways, and like the inhabitants of German towns, they too had come to realize that they weren't simply Florentines, Genoese, Venetians, or Neapolitans. They were all Italians and they wished to decide their own fates. At the time, there was only one small state in northern Italy that was free and independent.